I sat in the boardroom, watching my husband, now with his secretary, unaware that I controlled his company's future. He thought he had it all, but I was the one holding the cards. As I quietly used my shares to influence key decisions, I felt the power shift. The more I took control, the more I realized how much I could make him pay, not just in business, but in his personal life. I wasn't just a forgotten wife anymore. I was the force behind his empire's collapse. Before we dive back in, let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow, I've got something even more special lined up just for you. It wasn't supposed to be this way. The quiet hum of the house, the soft light filtering through the kitchen window, had always made this place feel like home, our home. I had spent years building this life with him, every step alongside him as his partner in marriage, his confidant in business, his support through every high and low. But that morning, everything changed. The sound of the door opening, the low murmur of voices, the faint laughter. It was supposed to be a normal day. And yet, in that moment, my world was torn apart. I had walked in, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. I had taken a step inside, paused at the threshold of the living room, and then everything froze. There he was. My husband. The man I had shared everything with for the past 15 years. And there she was too, his secretary. His secretary. Her head was tilted back in laughter, and he was standing just a little too close, his hand resting casually on the small of her back. My breath caught in my throat, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no mistaking it. The look in their eyes, the way they moved, the way they held themselves, it was all there. The intimacy. The connection. A connection I had never once felt in all the years I had been with him. I took a step back, a breath escaping me as the world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath me no longer solid. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't move. Then, my husband turned. He saw me standing there, his face blank for a brief moment before he quickly tried to cover the shock that must have registered in his expression. I wasn't expecting you home so soon, he said, his voice faltering. He didn't even bother to acknowledge her. His eyes moved to the floor, unable to meet mine. That single action told me everything I needed to know. He had been hiding it for a while. He'd known what he was doing, and he thought I wouldn't find out. I was still standing there, my body frozen in place as I processed the sight before me. My chest felt tight, a heavy lump lodged in my throat. There was a pain, a deep ache, that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The tears didn't come at first. Instead, there was just a stunned silence. But as I turned and walked away, the reality of it all began to sink in. The years we'd spent together, the family we'd built, the sacrifices I'd made, it all felt like a cruel joke. And then, I felt a quiet anger begin to rise in me, one I hadn't known I was capable of. He had done this. He had destroyed everything. He would think this was the end of it, that this moment, this discovery, would somehow give him the upper hand. That I would just quietly accept his betrayal and let him go on with his life, with her. But he was wrong. I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. As I sat in the silence of my bedroom, trying to process what had just happened, I knew that the next step was crucial. I couldn't let him see how hurt I was. I couldn't let him see how much this had torn me apart. I had to stay composed, had to think. There had to be a way to regain control, to turn this around. What he didn't know, what he could never have known, was that I wasn't just his wife. I wasn't just the woman he had taken for granted. I was something more. Something he had never fully understood. I was his biggest shareholder. And I wasn't going to let this betrayal go unpunished. When I look back on the years leading up to that moment, it feels like I was living in a different lifetime. A time before the pain, before the betrayal, when everything seemed so simple. Back then, I believed in the promises we made to each other, promises that I had built my whole life around. I thought we were partners in everything. I thought we had the same goals, the same dreams. But I was wrong. Our story began in college. I was young, ambitious, and a little naive. He was charismatic, brilliant, and driven in a way that drew people to him. We met by chance, at a mutual friend's party. He was talking to a group of people about his future plans, his vision for the world, and I remember thinking how strange it was that someone so young could be so certain about everything. There was something magnetic about him. I was drawn to him immediately, not just because of his confidence, but because he had this ability to make you believe that anything was possible. When we started dating, it felt like everything fell into place. We were a team, and I thought we always would be. But I knew even then that his ambitions ran deep. He wanted to build something. He wanted to create something big, something that would last. And I wanted to be by his side, helping him, supporting him. So, I did what I thought was the right thing. I became the backbone of our life. I put my own dreams on hold. I put his first. We got married right after college, and for a while, I was content with the life we built together. We moved into a small but charming house, and I started working part-time to help him financially, while also taking care of our home. He needed to focus on his career. His success was my success, and I had no problem putting my own ambitions aside to make sure he had the time and energy he needed to chase his dreams. And then, things started to change. Slowly at first. He became busier, staying late at the office, spending more time with colleagues than with me. I told myself it was just the demands of the job, just the growing pains of a new business. But deep down, I started to feel the distance between us, like a slow, creeping fog that I couldn't push away. There were days when I would find myself sitting alone in our living room, wondering if I even knew him anymore. But I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to believe that the man I had given everything to, the man I had devoted my life to, could drift away so easily. So, I stayed silent. I told myself that this was just a phase, that he would come back to me once everything settled down. Years passed, and the business grew. He was no longer just my husband. He was becoming a well-known figure in the industry. He had become a man of power, of influence. But with that power came a new set of priorities. And I was no longer one of them. He began to take more business trips, more late-night meetings. And as I watched him thrive, I realized something. I was no longer a part of the vision he had for his life. At first, I told myself it was okay. After all, I had made the choice to be there for him, to put his career first. But as the years wore on, I started to question whether it was all worth it. Did he even see me anymore? Did he appreciate everything I had sacrificed for him? I had given up so much of myself for the sake of our marriage, for the sake of us, but somewhere along the way, I had become invisible. It was when I started noticing small things, like his secretary's name coming up more and more, the way he would mention her during dinner, the way his eyes would light up when he talked about her, that I began to suspect something was off. I didn't want to believe it. I kept convincing myself that it was all in my head, that I was overthinking things. But the truth was hard to ignore. There were signs, and they were all pointing in one direction. I had sacrificed so much, built a life around this man, and yet, I couldn't help but feel like I was losing him. I didn't know what to do anymore. I had no voice, no power. I was just the wife, the one who kept everything running in the background while he chased his ambitions. But deep down, I knew I wasn't just his wife. I wasn't just his support. I was more than that. I had a secret. A secret that I had kept hidden for years. A secret that could change everything. But I wasn't ready to reveal it. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was dealing with. I had to wait. I had to watch him, see where this was going. But the truth was, I could feel the pieces of my life falling apart. I could feel him slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. And then, one fateful morning, I walked into that room, and everything changed. The betrayal didn't come as a sudden shock. It was more like a slow, sinking feeling that crept up on me over time. But nothing could have prepared me for the final blow. The moment I stood in that doorway, watching my husband and his secretary, the woman who had slowly become more of a fixture in our lives than I ever imagined, the world as I knew it crumbled in an instant. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that for a moment, I thought they might hear it. But they didn't. They didn't even look up, too wrapped up in their shared moment of intimacy. He was smiling at her, a smile I had only ever seen when he was completely at ease, as though nothing in the world could touch him. She was laughing, too freely, too easily, and I realized that something I had once thought of as secure, as unbreakable, was now a hollow shell. He had never looked at me that way. Not in the years we had been together. The way he looked at her was different. It was new, and it was dangerous. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that doorway. I couldn't seem to pull my eyes away from them, as though I was waiting for them to snap out of it, waiting for the reality to sink in that what they were doing was wrong. But they didn't stop. They didn't even seem to notice me standing there. Then, finally, he saw me. It was like the world shifted when his eyes met mine. The casual smile faltered just for a moment, and in that brief second, I saw the guilt. The recognition of what he had done, the understanding that everything he had built, the trust, the love, the years, was now a fragile house of cards, teetering on the edge. But even then, he didn't fully seem to grasp the extent of it. His first instinct wasn't to apologize, wasn't to come to me, to explain. No, his first instinct was to try to minimize it. "I wasn't expecting you home so early," he said, almost as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. As if I hadn't just caught him in the middle of betraying everything we'd worked for. His voice was steady, almost too steady, as if he were trying to convince not just me, but himself. I couldn't speak. The words were stuck, lodged somewhere deep inside me, refusing to come out. What could I say? Could I really yell at him, accuse him of destroying everything we had? Would it even matter? There was a dull ache in my chest, a weight that seemed to make it harder to breathe, to think. But I wasn't ready to break down. Not yet. Not in front of them. I turned on my heel and walked away without saying a word, feeling the tears rise in the back of my throat, threatening to spill over. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the hallway, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I needed to get out, to escape before the emotions overtook me. Once outside, I stood by the car, the cold air on my face helping to clear the fog in my mind. I couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe that after all these years, after all the sacrifices, after everything I had given him, he could do this. I wasn't just angry. I was heartbroken. I felt like a fool, like I had spent so many years living a lie, giving my all to a marriage that was never as solid as I thought. As I sat in the car, trying to get my breathing under control, I realized that I couldn't keep living in this lie. I couldn't let this happen, couldn't let him take everything from me. My heart, my trust, my love, without consequences. But what could I do? I wasn't a woman who had ever been in control of anything outside our home. I wasn't someone who had taken charge of my own life, had made decisions on my own. I had always been in the background, the dutiful wife, the one who supported him without question. But that was before I found out. Before the truth hit me like a freight train. And now, something was stirring inside me, a desire to fight back, to reclaim what was mine. To make sure that his betrayal didn't come without a price. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much power I had, how much I had been hiding without even knowing it. The truth was, I had a secret. One that could destroy him if I played my cards right. I wasn't just his wife. I wasn't just some passive partner. I was more than that. I had been quietly building something behind the scenes, something that could change everything. And now, I was going to use it. I didn't know exactly how I would do it yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. He would regret ever thinking he could betray me and get away with it. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. The kind of power that comes from knowing you hold the keys to your own fate. And this time, I wasn't going to just sit back and watch my life fall apart. This time, I was going to take control. But first, I had to wait. I had to plan. He would never see it coming. As the days dragged on, the feeling of betrayal began to settle deeper inside me. It was like a knot in my stomach that wouldn't loosen, a constant reminder that everything I thought I knew had been a lie. But despite the pain, there was something else simmering beneath the surface. Something I had buried for so long, something I had kept hidden, even from myself. I was no longer just a wife who had been wronged. I was something more. And I realized that in the silence of my own anger and sorrow, I had a choice. I could either wallow in the misery of what he had done to me, or I could take control. I could make him feel the weight of his actions, not just emotionally, but financially, professionally. And that's when it hit me, the one thing he never knew. I was his biggest shareholder. I had never told him, never shared with him the quiet moves I'd made behind the scenes, the investments I'd made in his company over the years. In the early days, it had been small, insignificant sums, just enough to give me a stake in the future. But over time, as the business grew and flourished, so did my holdings. Slowly but surely, I had built myself into a silent partner. He never knew. He never once suspected that I had been buying shares, quietly building power while he focused on the business itself. But now, as I sat there in the quiet of my home, staring out the window at the street where we had built our life together, I understood the full extent of my position. I wasn't just his wife anymore. I wasn't just the woman he had betrayed. I was the one who could take everything away from him if I chose to. For years, I had been so focused on supporting him, on being the person who held everything together. But now, I had the chance to turn the tables. I wasn't powerless, like I had once felt. I was a force in his life, whether he realized it or not. And I was done being the silent partner. The realization gave me a strange sense of calm, a quiet empowerment that I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I wasn't just hurting. I was planning. I was thinking. I began to make my moves slowly. I didn't rush it. If I wanted to use my shares to their fullest potential, I had to do it carefully, strategically. The last thing I wanted was for him to figure it out too soon. I needed him to think that everything was still normal, that he was still in control. Only then would I strike. I started by attending board meetings. I had always been a background presence, never one to assert myself in the business. But now I had a reason to. As I sat there, quietly listening to the discussions, I could see how easy it would be to shift the balance. The board members didn't know me as the wife. They knew me as the quiet shareholder who had stayed on the sidelines. They had no idea that I was more than just a passive observer. I started making connections. I reached out to key players in the company, to those who had been with the business from the beginning and who still held influence. I made my presence known, bit by bit, in subtle but deliberate ways. It wasn't long before I had earned the respect of a few of the board members, and soon enough, I found myself in a position where I could start pushing for change. I wasn't doing it out of malice. Not yet. Not at first. It was about gaining leverage, about building power where I had none before. And with each meeting, with each conversation, I felt more and more in control. But there was still one piece of the puzzle I had to work through. My husband. He had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, no idea that the ground was shifting beneath him. I could see it in his eyes when we spoke, the growing distance between us that he either didn't notice or didn't care to acknowledge. He was still caught up in his own world, still convinced that his affair with his secretary was something I would simply accept. But the truth was, he had underestimated me. I had become a player in my own right. He was no longer the man who held all the cards. I did. And soon he would realize that. He would realize that his betrayal wasn't just going to be something he could walk away from, not without consequences. As I sat in my study, reviewing the board's latest decisions, I felt a cold, calculating calm settle over me. This wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about control. It was about standing up for myself in a way I had never done before. I had spent years building a life around him, making sacrifices, always supporting him, always putting him first. But now, it was time for me to put myself first. It was time to take back everything he had stolen from me. And I would do it in a way that would hurt him the most. Not with anger or words, but with the one thing that mattered most to him: his empire. I wasn't just going to let him walk away from this. I was going to make him pay, not with revenge, but with the weight of his own mistakes. And when it was all over, I would have my life back. Not the life we had built together, but the life I had always deserved. The life that was mine to reclaim. It wasn't just about getting even, it was about reclaiming myself. And this time, no one was going to take that away from me. The first shift came subtly, almost imperceptibly. But as I began to make my moves behind the scenes, a quiet storm started to gather. He didn't notice at first. Why would he? To him, I was still the quiet, supportive wife. The one who stayed in the background, who didn't ask questions, who never demanded more than what he gave. He had no idea that the woman he had betrayed was now quietly orchestrating his downfall. I knew I had to be careful. This wasn't something I could rush. Every action had to be calculated. Every move had to be precise. One wrong step, and it would all unravel. I could feel the weight of the decision hanging over me, but for the first time in years, I also felt something else. Power. It was intoxicating, and it was mine for the taking. At the next board meeting, I walked in with a confidence I hadn't felt in years. The other members barely acknowledged me, until I made my first suggestion. I think it's time we reevaluated some of the current leadership strategies, I said, my voice calm but firm. My husband didn't even look up at first. But then, I saw the slight shift in his posture. He had been so used to being the one who controlled every conversation, every decision. But now, he couldn't ignore me. Not anymore. The room was silent for a moment, and I could see the other board members glancing at each other, sensing the shift in the dynamic. I could feel my grip tightening around the situation. They were starting to listen, to take me seriously. From that moment forward, I continued to assert myself. Each meeting, each conversation, I pushed for more influence. I didn't back down. I made decisions. I suggested changes. Slowly but surely, I began to take more control of the company, not through a dramatic coup, but through steady, deliberate actions. I was in a position now to affect the company's future in ways he could never have anticipated. I knew my husband must have felt something shifting, though he didn't understand it. He was still caught up in his affair, still thinking that he could run the business without me. But it wasn't just the business that mattered anymore. It was everything: our life, our marriage, my future. And the more I leaned into my newfound power, the more I realized just how much control I had. The first big move came when I made an official proposal to the board. I suggested that we reassign some key roles within the company. My husband, of course, was the CEO, but there were other positions, ones that could be restructured, ones that would allow me more influence. He didn't know how to respond when the proposal was passed. His world was suddenly being reshaped around him, and he couldn't even see it happening. At home, the tension between us was palpable. He was still acting as if everything was fine, still expecting me to be the wife he had left behind. He tried to talk to me about trivial matters, but the facade was too thin. There were no longer any comfortable conversations between us, no more easy laughter. The silence between us was deafening, and I could tell that he knew something was wrong. But he didn't know exactly what. I didn't let him in on my plans. Not yet. He still didn't know about my shares, my power in the company. He thought I was just a passive observer, a woman scorned. But what he didn't understand was that I had become the master of my own destiny. The woman who had quietly supported him for years had finally found her voice, and it was powerful. The next blow came when I reached out to a few of the major investors in the company. I began to build a coalition of my own, people who had the influence and the power to sway things in my favor. He had never paid attention to the small details of the company, never considered that someone else might be working behind the scenes, quietly amassing influence. But now, he was realizing that the company he had built was no longer his to control. One evening, after a particularly long day of negotiations, he sat me down at the dinner table. His eyes were tired, his face drawn with exhaustion. "What are you doing exactly?" he asked. There was a hint of desperation in his voice, but I could see the cracks starting to form. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. I looked at him, my expression neutral, as I took a slow breath. "What do you mean?" I asked, playing the part of the oblivious wife. "I'm just helping with the business, like I always have." The silence stretched between us. He searched my face, probably trying to gauge my reaction, but I kept my composure. Inside, though, I was trembling with excitement. It was finally happening. He was finally beginning to understand the depth of the changes that were unfolding around him. But I wasn't going to give him an easy way out. Not this time. I had waited too long. A week later, the final decision came. The board voted to restructure the leadership. His leadership. My proposal passed, and I was now officially in a position to influence the future direction of the company. But the real blow came when I made the call for him to step down. I knew that would devastate him, but it was time. "Effective immediately, you're no longer CEO," I said, my voice cold, detached. He stared at me in disbelief. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him, but that feeling was fleeting. I had spent too many years living in his shadow, watching him manipulate and control everything around him. He had taken so much from me. But now, I was the one in control. "How could you do this?" he asked, his voice trembling. You're my wife. How could you betray me like this?" I wasn't betraying him. I was taking back what was mine. "You betrayed me first," I replied quietly. "And now, I'm taking what's rightfully mine." He didn't say anything else. He simply stood there, speechless, as I took the reins of the company, as I finally stood in the power I had been denied for so long. In the months that followed, I watched as everything began to shift. The company, once his domain, was now under my control. My influence grew, not just in business, but in every part of my life. I no longer felt like the woman who had been abandoned, the one who had to live in the shadows. I had stepped into the light. I didn't need revenge. What I needed was justice. What I needed was to reclaim my power. And I had done it. The pain of betrayal was still there, but it was no longer all-consuming. It had transformed into something else, into strength. I had taken control of my life in a way I never thought possible. And as I sat at the head of the table in that final board meeting, I realized that I was no longer the woman who had been left behind. I was the woman who had rebuilt herself from the ashes. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And that was the sweetest victory of all.